Welcome. This is Unit 1, Video G. I'm going to circle back to the ADA. One of the components of the ADA doesn't just protect against discrimination on the basis of disability, but it also allows for a reasonable accommodation request to be made. And so that can be something as simple as making an existing facility by adding a small ramp up to the front entrance, or it could be something a little more elaborate, or acquiring or modifying equipment, providing qualified readers or interpreters for the employee to be able to do their job, modifying workplace policies, job restructuring, modifying work schedules and location, and additional leave if you think they'll be able to perform the essential functions at the end of their leave. There are some things that reasonable accommodation doesn't mean, some things that it doesn't mean. Elimination of essential functions of the job. If your job in the essential function is to lift 20 pounds and you can't lift but 2 pounds, then you can't perform the essential functions of your job with or without a reasonable accommodation. So just doing away with essential functions is not a requirement that employers have to engage in. Lowering production standards for the same reason as the first one that I mentioned. Indefinite leave policies, like I'll be back when I'm better. That puts the employer in a bad position. So we don't require employers to accommodate those types of requests. Open-ended job schedules, creating a job, like I could do this other job over here. All you have to do is do this. No, employers aren't required to do that. Personal use items that they have to provide, like wheelchairs, eyeglasses, etc. That's again not the employer's responsibility. And anything considered an undue hardship, things that cost a lot of money, provide safety risk, or create issues in time. So I want to go over a couple of examples, and we might go over these a little more detail in class, but an employee with an anxiety disorder who wants an accommodation that would move them away from coworkers whenever they cause him stress. If you think about that, you're like, oh, well, when somebody's caused stress, that's pretty measurable and easy, but I think, that's a bit of a vague situation. So, it could be a small stressor, a large stressor. And so that could be a little bit volatile for an employer to try and deal with. And so that may not be a reasonable accommodation request. An employee with a disability requests that the thermostat in their workplace be raised to a certain level to accommodate her disability. I have an autoimmune disorder, and I do very well in warm temperatures, let's say. And so I may not want it to be super cold like a lot of businesses are. They may not be able to accommodate my need for heat. So that may not be considered a reasonable accommodation. Just remember, not every accommodation request is a reasonable accommodation. On average, what do reasonable accommodations cost an employer? Well, according to the Job Accommodation Network, there are about 19% of accommodations that are requested by employees that are free. And about half of accommodations cost less than $500, and more than 80% cost less than $1,000. So what's the benefit to the employer by making these accommodations? Well, for one, they're not super expensive on average. And two, it's good for, it's just a good business model to provide those accommodations for employees if you're able to. And to support employees, because sometimes your employees come in with temporary disabilities and just need support, and that can also be a good morale booster for your employees if they know that you're going to treat them well in a time period where they're dealing with something that's like a health condition that is not something that they do on purpose. Again, I want to circle back to the Family Medical Leave Act that I talked about when I was talking about my superheroes. It applies to employers with 50 or more workers. It requires them to provide up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave to care for a spouse, child, or parent suffering with a serious medical condition. If the injured person is dealing with a serious injury or something that's defined as a military injury, you could be eligible for up to 26 weeks of unpaid leave. Again, these are all terms defined in the statute. And it doesn't have to be 12 weeks taken all at once. It can be in increments of hours and blocks of time versus, weeks or days. An employer must continue in a worker's health care, and they must be restored to a position upon return unless they're a key employee, like a CFO or a CEO, that it would be a little bit harder to do business without them in play. I want you to take a look at some of these examples that I have posted. We may circle back to those during our review as well. So take a look at all of those. When I look at employer mistakes, particularly with FMLA, not having an FMLA policy, specifically beyond the statute, relying on the statute to define all of your issues, having a policy on some of the requirements, but also just having an internal process for dealing with employees that need to take FMLA. Not telling your employees about FMLA, that's the worst thing you can do. You may think like, if I don't tell them about FMLA, they just won't take it. But a lot of times it's good to have information up front before a tragedy happens so that employees can reach out as soon as they have a qualifying event. Not confirming FMLA clock, tracking hours, just kind of letting them take time when they want and never really starting the clock on FMLA. Not having properly informed or trained your management for FMLA claim or for dealing with employees with FMLA issues. If you don't inform people, you can't expect to hold them accountable, and you can't expect the process that you have in place to work. Terminating an employee after FMLA request, that can actually be seen as retaliation and can open up a window of litigation opportunities. Mismanaging an employee's benefits as they're navigating their FMLA. Okay, this can be again seen as changes in terms and conditions of their employment, and can be grounds for a charge of discrimination even. Not understanding the intersection between the FMLA and ADA. And that's where I really want you to read that Bermuda Triangle article, and I'll post that as well for you to take a look at. Again, where FMLA ends, ADA begins, beyond the original notice, no requirement by the regulation to check in with the employee. So if FMLA runs out, can the employee perform the essential functions of their job with or without a reasonable accommodation? Again, that's where we start to see some crossover in the language between FMLA and the ADA. All right, so I got one more superhero to introduce you to, and that is GINA. GINA protects against discrimination through unlawful misuse of genetic information. Now, Congress is seldom proactive in anything, but they were proactive in protecting genetic information. Look at the date, 2008, and now we are running rampant with genetic information. And so they definitely created some components. So Title I applies to employer-sponsored health plans, and then Title II applies to the employment setting itself. Specifically, Title I prohibits genetic information being used to discriminate against an employee or to determine eligibility or set premiums for health insurance, especially if somebody's got a lot of genetic conditions that are going to predispose them to high medical bills. You can't use that information. Title II restricts the collection and the disclosure of genetic information. Now, there are some professors over in the College of Health Sciences that are doing some research, or we're doing some research on firefighters looking at a gene that responds differently to the carcinogens that you find in fires. And so if they have this gene, then they're more likely to see like cancerous results or cancerous outcomes because of their exposure to this carcinogen. And they know about this gene. That's something that could technically be used against, whether or not you're going to hire a firefighter if you think that they're going to, come back with a workers' comp claim later. And so we don't allow employers to use that information for that reason. And this is actually a law that covers private sector and government. So circle back around to the first question that I asked you at the beginning of this unit. Is there too much regulation, not enough regulation? And let's think some more of some areas that we could work to improve in, or areas that we need to be leaving alone. There is a set of questions in the Martashino book from Managing Employee Benefits, a Discriminatory Time Off Policy. You can go to Martashino, I think it's page 96 of this document, and actually page, looks like 85 or 88 in the actual book. And so please read through this scenario and answer the following questions that are listed on here. So reviewing Staff-On's policies, do you think that women are underrepresented in Staff-On's workforce? Do you think that staff-on's time off policy is discriminatory? And I really want you to think critically about this. Don't be so quick to jump into the first answer that you think of. Think about it and pull it apart a little bit and see if you can work through some of the content that we just covered in answering that question. All right, I want you to pretend that your friend was absent today from class. Write what you would say if you had to explain what we've talked about in this unit to your friend, and try and do so. And you don't have to spend an exorbitant amount of time in this, but think like generally, like if you had to go back and explain what we talked about today, or talked about over these last couple of videos, what you would say to them. Then as you reflect on this unit and this unit material in particular, what did you like about the unit material itself? What didn't you like? What are some concepts that you found that were pretty easy to understand, and what are things that are hard? Make sure to add those things that are hard or things that you want me to go over, the muddiest points. List that on as you learn in the respective documents that I've listed for that. And thank you very much. And I hope that you enjoyed this first unit of material, and we'll prepare for the quiz and then move on to unit 2 material, which is far more exciting, I promise.